Man takes mistress to event, but uncovers a shocking truth about his wife. A hook. Have you ever felt like you were living in a world where nothing is as it seems, where every choice you make was already planned for you? In this mind-bending story, a man discovers a truth so shocking, it shatters his entire reality. What happens when you realize you've been part of a game all along? Watch until the end to see how the game plays out, and whether there's any chance of escape. Gregory had never been so uneasy. Tonight was important. The gala was a grand event, attended by the city's elites. Yet, he felt an unfamiliar tension in his chest. His wife, Clara, was home, and Gregory had made a choice. He couldn't bear to face her there, so he brought Jennifer, his secret, his mistress. The car was sleek, the engine purring like a predator. Jennifer sat beside him, radiating beauty. Her smile was confident, as though she belonged in that world. Gregory, however, couldn't shake the feeling that he was suffocating. The closer they got to the venue, the heavier the silence between them became. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Jennifer noticed. She leaned over, her lips brushing his ear. "Are you all right?" she whispered. He forced a smile. "Just tired." They arrived, stepping out into the flashing lights of photographers. Jennifer laughed softly, her arm linked with his, but Gregory's eyes darted around. Was Clara here? He couldn't let her see him like this. He hadn't planned to meet her tonight. He couldn't. They entered the grand hall, where the rich and powerful mingled. The chandelier above cast a cold glow over everything. Laughter echoed through the vast space. Gregory's heart thudded painfully. His breath felt shallow. He scanned the crowd, hoping, praying he wouldn't see her. Then, his breath caught in his throat. At the far end of the room, Clara stood. Clara. She was smiling, dressed in a gown he didn't recognize, a gown he had never seen before. Her beauty was radiant, but there was something different, something unsettling. Gregory froze, unable to move. Jennifer followed his gaze. "Isn't that your wife?" she asked, her voice low. Gregory didn't answer. His heart was pounding. Clara wasn't alone. A tall man stood beside her, a man who looked familiar, but who he couldn't place. They laughed, whispered, as if they shared a secret. Gregory's pulse raced. What was going on? Why hadn't Clara told him about this? The man's face. It was all too familiar. Suddenly it hit him. That man was no, it couldn't be. He had to be wrong. But he wasn't. It was his own brother. Gregory's stomach dropped. His mind scrambled. How could this be? His brother Nathan was standing there with Clara. They were too close, too comfortable. His breath caught in his throat. Jennifer noticed his unease. "Gregory?" she whispered, her eyes narrowing as she followed his gaze. He couldn't speak. He felt as though the ground had vanished beneath him. What was happening? His brother. With Clara, it didn't make sense. Nathan had always been distant. But this was too much. Gregory's legs felt heavy as he forced himself to move. But he couldn't look away. Clara and Nathan were laughing again, their eyes locked in a way that made Gregory's chest tighten. There was no mistaking the connection between them. Gregory's fists clenched at his sides. What was going on? Was this some kind of cruel joke? He walked toward them, each step feeling like an eternity. Jennifer followed, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Clara finally noticed him. Her smile faltered for a brief moment. Gregory's heart pounded. He wasn't prepared for what he was about to hear. She looked between him and Nathan, her expression shifting. "Gregory," Clara said softly, her voice almost apologetic. He couldn't breathe. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. Clara looked down, then back up at him. "Nathan and I," she began, her words hanging in the air. Gregory felt a chill run down his spine. "We've been seeing each other," she confessed. Jennifer gasped beside him, her face pale. Gregory's world tilted. His brother, his wife, together. It was a truth he couldn't escape. He stumbled backward, his head spinning. Everything he thought he knew shattered in an instant. Nathan stepped forward, his face unreadable. "Greg, we didn't want you to find out this way," he said quietly, his voice devoid of regret. Gregory's mind raced, but his body felt frozen. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. Everything around him blurred. The laughter, the lights, the grand hall. It all faded away. All that remained was the bitter sting of betrayal. The room seemed to close in on him. Gregory's chest felt tight, suffocating. His breath shallow. He stared at Nathan, at Clara. The betrayal was so raw. It was almost physical. His brother, the one person he'd trusted, had stolen everything. Clara's face twisted in what could only be described as guilt, but there was no remorse in her eyes. "Why?" Gregory's voice was a whisper, barely audible. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Nathan stepped closer. "You've been distant, Greg," he said, his tone calm. "Too calm. You never noticed. She needed someone, and I needed someone too." Gregory felt the heat of anger flare up in his veins. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but his body refused to obey. Instead, he simply stood there, rooted to the spot. "Is this what you wanted?" he finally managed to say, his voice trembling with fury. Clara didn't answer, her eyes flicking nervously between him and Nathan. Gregory's mind spun. How long had this been going on? Was this a secret affair or something deeper, more calculated? Nathan began, but Gregory's gaze cut him off. "I don't want to hear it," he spat. The words felt like acid on his tongue. Jennifer stood behind him, silent, her face pale as she processed what was unfolding. Gregory could feel her eyes on him, but he couldn't focus on her. His entire world had tilted on its axis, and now it felt like he was watching it all fall apart from a distance. His mind screamed for him to leave, to walk away and never look back. But something kept him rooted to the floor, his heart beating louder than anything else in the room. He couldn't look at Clara anymore. He couldn't bear to. But then something unexpected happened. Clara stepped toward him, her hand reaching out as if to comfort him. Gregory recoiled, a wave of disgust rising in his throat. I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The truth was out, and it had shattered everything. "I don't need your apology," Gregory snapped. He turned on his heel, storming away from them. His mind raced, each step carrying him further from the two people who had once meant everything to him. But before he reached the exit, he paused. He couldn't leave without one last look, without confronting the reality of his world crumbling. He turned back, just in time to see Nathan and Clara whispering, their heads close together. Gregory's stomach churned, and then it hit him. The realization hit him like a freight train. The truth was far darker than he'd ever imagined. That a cold shiver ran down Gregory's spine. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just his brother. It was something more, something hidden in the way they spoke. The way Clara's hand lingered too long on Nathan's arm. Gregory felt a sudden, unsettling clarity. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a conspiracy. His mind flashed to the past. The subtle changes in Clara's behavior, the distance between them. The odd moments when Nathan seemed to know too much, as if he was watching from the shadows. Gregory's heart pounded. His body screamed at him to leave, but his feet remained planted. A sharp thought struck him. It felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. Something wasn't right. Gregory stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he observed the two of them. The way they interacted, the way they spoke. They weren't just lovers. They were collaborators. Something clicked in his mind. The memories, the inconsistencies. They had planned this. Planned it all. Gregory felt a sickening realization twist inside him. The affair was just the surface. They had been manipulating him from the start. He had been a fool, a pawn in their game. His eyes darted to the side of the room, where the shadows clung to the edges of the walls. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was another man, tall and imposing. A chill swept over Gregory. He recognized him instantly. This man had been present at the beginning of everything. The strange figure who had turned up at the house that night. The one who had watched him from a distance, his intentions unclear. He knew now. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The man was part of it. Gregory's blood ran ice-cold as the man approached. Nathan and Clara didn't even glance up at him. They were too absorbed in their quiet conversation, their shared secret. Gregory could barely breathe. The stranger's eyes met Gregory's, and a sick smile spread across his face. "You're too late," the man said, his voice low and cold. Gregory's knees nearly buckled beneath him. It was a warning, a final, damning truth. He had never been in control. He was never meant to be. Everything, his marriage, his career, his life, had been a carefully orchestrated lie. The man's smile widened, as if enjoying Gregory's shock. "You've been living in their world," he continued, "and now it's too late to leave." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Gregory's heart thudded painfully against his ribs. Too late? What did that mean? The man took another step closer, his eyes glinting with something dark. "Who are you?" Gregory rasped, barely able to form the question. The stranger smiled, a twisted amusement playing on his lips. "You've been a part of something far bigger than you realize," he said, voice dripping with malice. "And now it's too late to turn back." Gregory's mind raced, but the words felt like a fog, thick and impenetrable. He wanted to back away, to flee, but his legs wouldn't obey. All he could do was stand there, rooted to the spot. Suddenly, Clara looked up. Her gaze met his, and for a brief moment, he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of something like fear, but quickly masked by the facade of indifference. It was as if she was aware of something he didn't know, something that was beyond him. Gregory opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He was drowning in confusion, in a sense of impending doom he couldn't escape. Jennifer, still standing behind him, spoke up, her voice trembling. "What is this? What's going on?" Nathan turned slowly, his eyes cold and unreadable. "It's time, Greg," he said, as if they were simply finishing a conversation from years ago. "We've played our parts, but now you're a part of something bigger than you ever imagined." Gregory felt his knees weaken. The weight of the truth crashed over him, suffocating him. He had thought it was about betrayal, but this was something far darker, far more dangerous. The man in the shadows stepped closer, his presence looming. "You're not just part of a family," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're part of a plan, a long-term game, and now you're in too deep to back out." Gregory's breath hitched. The walls seemed to close in on him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything he thought he knew, his life, his relationships, his very identity, was collapsing around him. The world he had built, the life he had carefully crafted, was nothing more than an illusion. The man's smile never wavered. "And now," he said, "the game truly begins." Gregory's mind was spinning, a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He wanted to run, to escape, but he couldn't. His legs refused to move, as though they were shackled to the ground. And as he stood there, caught between the truth and the nightmare, the room seemed to grow darker, the air colder. He wasn't just trapped in this moment. He was trapped in their world, a world he could never leave. The chill in the air deepened. Gregory's skin crawled as the man's words echoed in his mind. "You think you're the only one in the dark, Greg." Nathan's voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold. Gregory wanted to shout, to demand answers, but his throat was tight, as if something was choking him from the inside. The stranger took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Gregory's. "We've been watching you," the man said, his voice thick with contempt. "You've been the perfect pawn, the perfect tool." Gregory's stomach twisted. He couldn't comprehend what was happening, what they were telling him. A tool? Watching him? How had he not seen it? All those times Nathan had been so helpful, so supportive. All those strange phone calls Clara had taken in the dead of night. The secret meetings that never made sense. It was all connected. But to what? Clara's face was unreadable now, her eyes avoiding his, her body stiff as though bracing for something. For what, he didn't know. He felt her presence more than he saw her. She was part of it too, and that realization, more than anything, sent a cold, paralyzing fear crawling down his spine. Jennifer, standing beside him, was shaking. He could feel the tremors in her body, but she said nothing. She was as trapped as he was. The man in the shadows stepped closer, his boots clicking against the marble floor, each step a reminder that there was no escape. Gregory's voice barely managed to break free. "What do you want from me?" The stranger's eyes flashed with amusement. "We want you to understand," he said slowly, as though speaking to a child. "You were never meant to be in control. You were never meant to be the hero of your own story. You're just a necessary part of the plan." Gregory's mind spiraled, but he couldn't focus. The weight of their words was suffocating. The man wasn't done. Clara's role was to keep you distracted. Nathan's was to lead you into our world. And yours, he paused, letting the silence stretch painfully. Yours was to believe you were in control. Until we were ready to make our move. Gregory's heart stopped. They'd used him, manipulated him. All this time, he'd been nothing more than a tool in their game. It hit him like a tidal wave. The plans, the meetings, the strange, unexplained things that had happened in his life. It had all been part of this sickening, twisted game. And he was nothing but a pawn on their chessboard. The man smiled again, but this time there was no amusement. There was nothing but cold finality in that smile. "You're too far in, Greg," he said, "and there's no way out." Gregory's pulse raced. He could feel the panic rising inside him, clawing its way up his throat. But as he looked around at the people who had once been his world, his wife, his brother, the stranger who had been watching him, he realized something more terrifying. He wasn't just trapped in this room. He was trapped in their world. A world he could never escape from. And the worst part, he hadn't even known the game had started. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like a blanket closing in over him. Gregory's breath came in shallow gasps. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body refused to respond. Everything felt distant now, as though he was watching his life unfold from outside his own body. Clara's gaze met his, but there was no softness in her eyes, no recognition of the man he used to be. She was part of this, a deep, twisted part. Jennifer stood frozen, still too shocked to move, her eyes flicking between him and the strangers around them. She was just as trapped, just as tangled in their web. Gregory's thoughts scrambled, each one competing for dominance in his mind. How long had they been planning this? How long had they been watching him, controlling him, shaping his every move? The stranger's footsteps echoed as he took another step closer, the sound like a hammer driving the truth deeper into Gregory's chest. "You don't get it, do you?" the man said, his voice soft but filled with venom. Gregory's heart pounded in his ears. He wanted to lash out, to throw a punch, but he was paralyzed by the weight of everything he'd learned. The man was right. He hadn't seen it. He hadn't realized the depth of it until now. There had always been small signs, moments where something felt off, but he'd dismissed them. He had been too busy, too trusting, to see the cracks forming all around him. Clara, Nathan, this was all planned. Gregory finally croaked, his voice thick with disbelief. Clara's lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came out. Nathan stepped forward, his eyes cold. "Not planned, Greg," he said quietly. "Predicted." Gregory's mind buzzed. "Predicted? What does that even mean?" he demanded. Nathan gave him a pitying look. "You were always meant to fail. Always meant to be the one who was left in the dark. You were never going to be in control." Gregory's mind spun. Was this their grand scheme? To break him down? To manipulate him into a life he never chose? The stranger finally spoke again, his voice slow and deliberate. "It's bigger than your marriage, bigger than your career. This has been in the making for years." Gregory shook his head, unable to process it all. Years? How had he been so blind? "Why didn't you just tell me?" he whispered, his voice breaking. Clara flinched as though the question physically hurt her. But the man beside her, the stranger, simply smiled darkly. "You were never supposed to know, Greg," he said with a calmness that made Gregory's skin crawl. "But now you do. Now you see. And there's no turning back." A cold knot twisted in Gregory's stomach. Everything was slipping away. He had trusted them. But this wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was a conspiracy that stretched deeper than he could ever imagine. And no matter how hard he fought, he couldn't escape it. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of the truth that hung like a fog around him. Gregory's mind was reeling, trying to connect the dots that had never made sense before. But now, everything was falling into place in a way he could never have anticipated. The whispers, the subtle movements in the background of his life. Clara's coldness, Nathan's too casual demeanor, the stranger, watching him from the edges of his memory. It was all part of something bigger, something far darker. "Why me?" Gregory asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was desperate for an answer, even though he knew it wouldn't change anything. The stranger's smile twisted further, something wicked in his eyes. "Why not you?" he said with a shrug, his tone indifferent. "You were the perfect pawn. You always thought you had control, but we guided you. Pushed you when we needed to. You were just too blind to see it." Gregory's chest tightened, the weight of those words sinking in like sharp needles. He had been a puppet, dancing on invisible strings for who knows how long. He thought of his life, his marriage, his brother, his career, and it all felt like a carefully scripted show. He was just a character, a placeholder in someone else's story. "You think you're the first to be in this position," the stranger continued, stepping closer. "You think you're the first person we've controlled, manipulated? No, Greg. You're just another casualty in a much larger game." A shiver ran down Gregory's spine as he tried to process the enormity of what was being said. This wasn't just about Clara or Nathan or even the stranger. It was something far larger, far more dangerous. He felt the floor beneath him seem to tilt. The walls closed in, pressing against him from all sides. Jennifer reached for his arm, her grip trembling. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are they saying? What do they want?" Gregory couldn't answer her. He couldn't make sense of it either. But the pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture he didn't want to see. Clara's face was expressionless, her eyes distant, as though the woman he had once loved had vanished completely. Nathan looked at him with cold, calculating eyes. And the stranger, the man who had been lurking in the shadows, was now standing directly in front of him, as though daring him to make a move. Gregory swallowed, his mind scrambling for something, anything that could bring him back from this abyss. But there was nothing except the cold, unshakable truth. "You were never meant to win," the stranger said quietly. "None of you were. This world, this game is not for the weak." Gregory's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to fight, wanted to scream, but all he felt was the overwhelming sense of being trapped. "You're not even the player, Greg," the stranger continued, his tone almost pitying. "You were never more than a distraction, a means to an end, a means to an end." Gregory's blood ran cold. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying speed. His life, his very existence, had been nothing more than a cog in a machine he didn't even know existed. And now that he understood, it was too late. The man's smile stretched wider. "You've seen too much now," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "And there's no way out." Gregory stood there, paralyzed, as the weight of the words pressed down on him. There was no escape. Not from this. Not from them. He was trapped. The room seemed to close in tighter, the walls pressing against Gregory with a suffocating force. Every breath he took felt heavier than the last. The stranger's smile remained, cold and unwavering. Gregory's heart raced, panic rising like a tidal wave. But no matter how hard he fought to push it down, it wouldn't subside. There was nowhere to run. The stranger stepped forward, and Gregory instinctively took a step back. His body screamed at him to flee, but his legs were too weak to obey. "You're in too deep now," the man said, his voice laced with dark amusement. "We've already begun the final phase, Greg. You're already part of it." Gregory's mind scrambled, trying to make sense of the situation. But the pieces scattered like shards of glass, cutting into him with every new realization. He was no longer in control of his own life. He never had been. He had been a puppet, strung along by people he had trusted. People who had been playing him like a game piece, all while he remained blind to the truth. Jennifer, still gripping his arm, trembled beside him. Her voice was barely audible, but it cut through the fog of fear in his mind. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "What's happening? What do they want from us?" Gregory opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had no answers, only confusion. His own thoughts betrayed him, twisted and broken, as though someone had stolen his clarity. Nathan's eyes narrowed. "It's already too late for you, Greg. For both of you." His voice was devoid of emotion, cold as stone. The stranger stepped closer, his breath warm against Gregory's skin, his words deliberate, almost like a final sentence. "This isn't your world anymore. You're out of the game, but the game isn't over. It never ends. It just moves on." Gregory's mind snapped into a blur. The game? What game? How could he have been so blind, so foolish to believe he had control of any part of his life? The truth was finally sinking in, sharp and bitter. Everything, their faces, their voices, their actions, had been scripted, planned out long before he even knew what was happening. It was a game to them, and he was just another piece on the board. Gregory felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. The room around him seemed to pulse, alive, with an ominous energy. There was no way out. And then, as if sensing his desperation, the stranger reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. A small, black envelope, sealed shut with a deep red wax. He held it out to Gregory. "Take it," he said, his voice like ice. "This is your final choice." Gregory stared at the envelope, a lump forming in his throat. His hands shook, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Jennifer tugged at his sleeve, but he couldn't take his eyes off the envelope. What was inside? A decision that would change everything, or just another cruel twist of fate? The stranger's eyes glittered with an unsettling intensity. "Do you want to know what comes next?" he asked. "Or do you want to keep playing the part you were given?" Gregory's mind screamed at him to say no, to reject whatever was inside that envelope. But his body betrayed him. He reached out, trembling, and took it. The seal broke with a soft crack, and Gregory's fingers brushed the paper inside. The world felt like it stopped. For just a moment, everything was silent. And then, as he opened the letter, a chill ran down his spine. The words were brief, but devastating. "Welcome to the real game, Greg. There's no turning back now. The room went dark. The darkness swallowed him whole. For a brief moment, Gregory stood frozen, staring at the black envelope in his hands, as if the words written inside were something tangible, something that could pull him into another reality. His eyes struggled to focus, but everything around him seemed to blur, the shadows closing in like a living thing. He could hear his heartbeat, loud and frantic, echoing in his ears. It was as though the world had gone silent, all except for the pounding rush of blood in his veins. He looked up, but the room was now completely shrouded in darkness, and the people around him, Clara, Nathan, Jennifer, were silhouettes, their shapes barely visible, their faces unreadable. The stranger's voice broke the silence. "You've made your choice, Greg. Now, it's time to face what's next." His words sent a jolt through Gregory's body, snapping him out of the fog. The letter's words had been like a warning, a final push into a world he had never asked for, a world he didn't understand. But now he had to follow. There was no turning back. He swallowed hard, struggling to breathe, to think. What's going on?" His voice cracked as the words escaped him. Nathan stepped forward, his shadow looming like a predator. "It's simple," he said, his voice calm, almost eerily so. "You were always meant to be part of something bigger, Greg. You're not a victim here. You're just another player in a game that's far older than you know." Gregory's pulse quickened. "What game? What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice shaking now. Clara's silhouette moved behind Nathan, her voice soft, but filled with a cold finality. "You think you were in control. You think you've made choices in your life. You've been controlled from the start. We've been guiding you, leading you down this path." Gregory's breath hitched in his chest. Guided? He had never asked for this. He had never chosen any of this. "But I didn't know." His words faltered as the weight of the truth crashed down on him. His life had been nothing but a carefully constructed illusion, and he had been a puppet all along. "You knew more than you think." Nathan's voice was low, almost comforting, as if trying to placate a child. "You just never looked close enough. You never asked the right questions." The stranger's laugh cut through the air, cold and unsettling. "He's right. You were never meant to understand until now." The words felt like poison, burning in his mind, leaving him gasping for air. Everything around him felt like it was collapsing, like the walls themselves were closing in on him. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. "I didn't choose this," Gregory shouted, the panic surging inside him like a wild storm. "I didn't ask for any of this." There was a brief silence, and then the stranger's voice emerged from the dark again. "You don't need to choose anymore. It's already been chosen for you." The ground beneath Gregory seemed to shift, as though the very foundation of reality had fractured. The darkness felt suffocating now, and the shapes of Clara, Nathan, and the stranger seemed to draw closer, their faces still hidden in the blackness. Jennifer's soft voice reached him from behind. "Gregory, what's happening? What's in the letter? What does it mean?" But Gregory didn't have an answer. He was numb, frozen in place as the world around him began to warp and distort. The letter he had opened seemed to burn in his hands, the paper crinkling like it was about to turn to ash. "You can't escape it, Greg," Nathan said, his voice dripping with something darker now. "The game has already begun. You were always going to be part of it. No matter what you do, you're already in too deep." Gregory's world tilted, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he could hear the echo of a clock ticking somewhere in the distance. Time was running out, and no matter how hard he tried to break free, he was trapped in their world now. And the game? The real game? It was only just beginning. The world around him seemed to tilt, the edges blurring as if reality itself was warping under the weight of everything he was learning. The suffocating darkness pressed closer, making it harder to breathe. He could feel the cold sweat soaking through his clothes, his body trembling with the realization that everything he had known had been a lie. Gregory's chest tightened, his mind racing as he desperately tried to make sense of the madness unfolding around him. "You're not just a pawn," the stranger's voice echoed from the shadows, each word sending a shock through his body. "You're a player, but only when we say you are." His mind raced. Player? A pawn. He didn't want to be part of any game. He had never asked for this, but it was clear now there was no choice. There was no escape. As the dark shapes of Clara and Nathan loomed before him, their faces still obscured by shadows, the stranger's words burned into his mind like a brand. "You've been part of the plan from the very beginning," the man continued. "You just didn't know it, but now you do. And now it's time for you to take your place in the story we've written." The words felt like a death sentence. Gregory stumbled back, trying to back away, but his legs refused to move. It was as if something had anchored him to the spot, holding him there against his will. His mind spun as he tried to understand. A story? Written? Everything, his marriage, his career, his relationships, had been manipulated, controlled. It was all part of some grand narrative he had never asked to be a part of. "No," he whispered, the words hoarse, barely audible. "I never wanted this. I never asked for any of this." Clara stepped forward, her face finally emerging from the shadows. Her eyes were cold, calculating, like a stranger's. The woman he had once loved felt like a ghost now, a mere figment of a past he could never return to. "It doesn't matter what you wanted, Greg," she said, her voice flat, almost detached. "The story was never about what you wanted. It was about what we needed." Gregory's breath caught in his throat as her words settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He looked around wildly, searching for something, anything to cling to. But there was nothing. He was trapped in their world, a world that had been created long before he even knew it. The walls around him seemed to pulse with the force of his realization. He wasn't just trapped in a room. He was trapped in a story, in a game, a world controlled by people who had always known the rules and the outcome. "You're the final piece, Greg." Nathan's voice was steady, almost gentle now, like a teacher explaining something to a slow student. "The game can't move forward without you. And now that you've seen the truth, there's no going back." Gregory's mind was racing. His hands shook as he clenched the crumpled letter in his grip. He had been part of this all along, part of their game, and now there was no escape. "No." Gregory whispered again, more to himself than to them. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the oppressive weight of their words, the coldness in their eyes, told him everything he needed to know. This was real, and there was no way out. The stranger's cold laugh echoed in the darkness, his voice sending chills down Gregory's spine. "You can fight it all you want. You can scream and beg, but it won't change anything. The story is already written, and you're nothing more than a character in it." Gregory's vision swam, the world around him blurred, his mind threatening to unravel completely. He wanted to scream, to shout, to run far, far away. But the darkness swallowed his thoughts, his cries, his breath. And in that moment, Gregory knew something far more terrifying. He was never going to escape. The game was his life now, and it would continue, whether he liked it or not. Gregory's mind reeled as he tried to hold on to any shred of reality. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows swirling around him as if alive, feeding on his confusion and fear. He stood in the center of their world, a place he no longer recognized, surrounded by people who had once been his family. But now, they were strangers, players in a game he hadn't even realized he was part of. He could feel the pulse of the darkness around him, thick and oppressive, like the air itself was made of lies. His hands shook as he clutched the crumpled letter, the words still burning in his mind. Asterisk, welcome to the real game, Greg. There's no turning back now, asterisk. He wanted to deny it, wanted to scream at them all, to demand answers, to fight against whatever twisted world they had created. But deep down, he knew there was no escaping it. There never had been. Nathan stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the floor like a predator stalking its prey. The air around him seemed to freeze. "It's too late to run, Greg." Nathan's voice was almost pitying now. "You've seen the truth. You've felt the pull. Now you have to play your part, just like everyone else." Gregory opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came. His throat was dry, his heart hammering in his chest, as if the very act of speaking would shatter the fragile illusion he had left. Jennifer's voice was a whisper, raw with fear. What does it mean, Greg? What's happening?